The light at the edge of the Marin Gap was not supposed to be there, and the watchkeeper Ossian Vale had spent 40 years learning exactly which lights belonged. He froze at his station, inside the listening ring of Caro Deep, a station built from a hollowed asteroid that hung at the lip of a dead trade lane. For 19 generations his people, the Tiruk, had kept this post. They were a quiet folk of long memory and longer patience, and Ossian was their chronicler, the one who wrote down what the instruments saw so that the next watcher would not be surprised. He had written down comets. He had written down drifting hulks and cold beacons, and the slow turning of stars. He had never written down a fleet. The light was a fleet. It came out of the dark place that the old charts marked with a single warning symbol and no name. Out of the unmade, where causality went soft and time ran in pools instead of lines. Nothing came out of the unmade. Things went in and were forgotten, and the forgetting was so complete that even the records of their going turned to noise. Ossian had read those records. They were the saddest documents in the Tirak archive, because they were blank. He counted the lights. His hands shook. 240 ships, holding a formation so tight and so calm that it looked drawn rather than flown. They were gray, the gray of old iron under starlight, and they were scarred in ways that did not match any weapon the Tirak knew. The scars were not burns, they were absences, places where the hulls simply stopped, as if something had reached in and removed a section of the ship, and then the ship had grown a memory of itself back over the wound. Ossian opened a channel to the station core, and his voice would not come out steady. He said the only words that mattered. Something has returned from the unmade. The station woke around him. Lights climbed the long ribs of the asteroid. The old defense lattice, never once fired in his lifetime, hummed up out of its sleep with a sound like a held breath. Across the listening ring, 12 of his fellow Tirok pulled themselves to their stations and stared at the same impossible readout, and not one of them spoke, because there were no procedures for this. There was only the archive, and the archive said the same thing on every page about the unmade. Whatever goes in does not come back. These had come back. The lead ship of the formation was larger than the rest, a long blunt wedge with a spine of dark towers, and it carried markings on its flank that the station's translators could not read at first. They were old, not old the way a grandparent is old the way bedrock is old. The translation engine ground through its deepest tables, the ones nobody used, the ones that held dead and theoretical tongues, and it found a match in a layer of language that the Tiruk themselves had only ever recorded as a rumor. The markings said the ship was named Candlewake, they said the fleet was called the Long Vigil, and they said the registry date, and when the registry date resolved on Ossian's screen, he sat back so hard his chair groaned. The date was a little over 1 million years old. He did the arithmetic 3 times because he did not believe it. The Tirak kept the longest continuous records of any species in this arm of the galaxy, and their records went back 400,000 years before they dissolved into myth. This fleet predated all of it. This fleet had launched into the dark before the Tirok had cities, before they had writing, before the species that taught the Tirok to write had themselves come down from the trees of whatever world had made them. 1 million years. The number meant nothing. It was just a wall. A signal touched the station. It was weak, formal, and patient, like a letter written long ago and only now delivered. The translation engine caught it, chewed it, and laid the words out plain. "This is the Long Vigil," the message said. "We have been away. We are coming home. Please confirm the war is over." Ossian read it twice. Then he understood, all at once, the shape of the thing he was looking at, and a cold went through him that had nothing to do with the station's air. These ships did not know. They did not know that 1 million years had passed. They did not know that whatever they had left to defend was dust, that whatever they had been fighting was a fossil, that the species who built them had either died or grown so far beyond these gray wedges that the wedges were less than fossils to them. The fleet was sailing home to a house that had crumbled before the Tirok were born, and it was asking, with terrible politeness, whether it could finally put down its guns. Ossian's people had a word for what he felt, and the word did not translate cleanly, but the nearest shape of it was the grief you feel for a thing that does not yet know it should be grieving. He reached for his recorder. Whatever happened next, it would be written down. That was the one promise the Tirok kept. Someone had to remember, because the whole horror of the unmade was that it made remembering impossible, and the whole point of Caro Deep was to stand at the edge of the forgetting and refuse to look away. He began to write. The fleet did not slow as it cleared the unmade. If anything, it grew more certain, the formation tightening, the lead ship Candlewake, drifting half a length ahead like a hand held out in greeting. The gray hulls turned in the starlight, and Ossian saw their full size for the first time, and felt his stomach drop. Each ship was a city. The smallest of the 240 was longer than Caro Deep itself, and Caro Deep was a mountain that had been hollowed by his ancestors over 600 years. And then, behind the fleet, the dark moved. It came out of the unmade after them, and it was not light, and it was not a ship. It was a smear across the stars, a place where the constellations behind it stopped being constellations, and became a long gray nothing, a hole shaped like a thing that did not want to be looked at. Where it passed, the instruments of Caro Deep began to disagree with each other. One sensor said it was 3 minutes ago. Another said it was tomorrow. A third simply stopped reporting and displayed, in the calm machine language of the station, a single line that Ossian had never seen a machine produce. It said, "I do not remember what I was measuring." Ossian's blood went to ice. The thing in the dark had followed the fleet out. It had chased them through 1,000,000 years and across the soft places of the universe, and it had not stopped, and it was here now at the edge of his station, and it was hungry in a way that did not show up as heat or motion or intent on any reading the Tirok had ever designed. The fleet knew it was there. Of course they knew. They had been running from it, or toward it, for longer than there had been Tirok to watch. The formation did not break. The lead ship did not flinch. A second signal came across the link, and it was addressed not to the station, but to the dark behind them, and the translation engine caught the edge of it and rendered it as best it could. The message from Candlewake to the thing in the dark was 4 words long. Not this house, not anymore. And then the 240 gray ships turned, all at once, with the slow, terrible unity of a thing that had practiced this turn for 1,000,000 years, and they put themselves between the smear in the stars and the little asteroid station full of frightened watchers who had done nothing but write the truth down. Ossian Vale, chronicler of Caro Deep, gripped the edge of his console and watched a fleet older than his entire civilization decide to make its last stand in front of strangers it had met 4 minutes ago, and he understood that he was about to witness something that the Tirok would either remember forever or forget completely, depending entirely on which of these two ancient things won. He bent over his recorder, and his hand was steady now, because the writing was the only thing he could do, and he was going to do it well. He wrote, "They came back. After everything, they came back, and the first thing they did was stand in front of us." The smear in the stars stopped moving, and somehow its stillness was worse than its motion. Ossian watched the readouts crawl. The thing the old charts called the unmade was not, he now understood, a place. It was a thing that lived in a place, and the place had taken its name from the thing the way a den takes its name from the beast. The Tirok archive had it half right and half wrong, the way archives always did when no one survived to correct them. People had gone into the dark and not come back, yes, but they had not simply died. They had been taken apart from the inside of time, unwoven, the thread of their existence pulled until the knot that was a person, a ship, a civilization, came loose and was gone, as if it had never been pulled tight at all. The fleet had a name for it too. The translation engine pulled the name out of the formal traffic that now flowed between the gray ships, and it rendered it as the unmaking, and then, in the older parts of the signal, as a single proper noun the humans used among themselves when they were not being formal. They called it the threadless, as if it were a person, as if, somewhere in 1,000,000 years of running, they had decided that the only way to fight a thing was to give it a name and hate it specifically. Ossian found that he respected that. A third message arrived, and this one was for Caro Deep. It was patient and clear, and it came from the ship called Candlewake, and the voice the translation engine assigned it was even and low and very, very tired. "This is Vigil Lead," the message said, "to the station at the edge of the gap. We are reading 212 of you aboard. We are reading your defense lattice powering up. Stand it down. It will not help you against the thing behind us, and we would rather it not be pointed at us when we move. We are not here to take anything. We are here to finish something. Hold your fire, and hold your station, and, if you can, hold your memory. That last part matters more than you know. Ossian looked at the station master, an old Tirok named Hesso whose shell had gone pale at the rim with age. Hesso's eyes were fixed on the readout. Stand the lattice down, Hesso said quietly. If they wanted us dead, we would already be unmade. Stand it down, and let the chronicler do his work. The lattice powered down with a long sigh, and across the listening ring, the Tirok turned from their useless weapons to their instruments, because if they could not fight then by every law their people had ever written, they could at least watch, and watching was the oldest thing they did. Out beyond the asteroid, the fleet of the Long Vigil arranged itself. It was not the arrangement of a panicked force. Ossian had seen recordings of battles, the ugly scrambles of the small wars the Tirok had survived, and those had looked like flocks of frightened birds. This looked like a sentence being written. The 240 ships slid into a shape that the station's geometry engine struggled to classify, a deep three-dimensional lattice of overlapping arcs, every ship covering the gap left by two others, every gun able to reach the same point of space from 4 directions at once. They had done this before. They had done this 10,000 times before. They moved like a single animal that happened to be made of cities. And then they waited. And the waiting was the part that broke something open in Ossian's chest. Because the fleet was not waiting for the enemy. The enemy was right there. The fleet was waiting for the station to finish standing down its weapons, so that when the killing started, none of it would land on the strangers they had decided to protect. 1,000,000 years, Ossian thought. 1,000,000 years of running, and they spent their last 4 minutes being polite. The threadless moved. It did not move the way a ship moves. It moved the way a stain spreads. The smear across the stars elongated, reached. And where it reached the instruments of Caro Deep began to lie. The clock on Ossian's wall ran backward, for the length of a breath, and then forward, too fast, and then settled, wrong, 6 seconds ahead of where it had been. A junior watcher 2 stations down made a small sound of fear, because her own hand had aged in front of her, the skin going thin and spotted, and then snapping back to young, as the edge of the thing brushed the station's outer sensors and pulled at the thread of local time. "Hold," said Hesso, though his voice shook. "Hold and watch." The first ship of the Long Vigil to engage was not Candlewake. It was a smaller wedge near the lower arc of the lattice, and Ossian's instruments tagged it with a name out of the fleet's traffic. It was called Morrow's Keep. When the reaching edge of the threadless touched it, the watchers expected to see it unwoven, to see a city-sized ship come apart into nothing, the way the old records implied. That is not what happened. Morrow's Keep lit up, not with fire, with time. Ossian had no other word for it, and he would spend years afterward trying to find a better one and failing. The ship's hull flared with a hard, steady, almost stubborn light, and where the threadless tried to pull the ship's thread loose, the ship pulled back. The instruments showed it plainly, in the cold, honest numbers the Tirok trusted above all things. The thing in the dark was trying to make Morrow's Keep have never existed, and Morrow's Keep was refusing. It was holding its own past in place with sheer brute insistence, anchoring every second of its 1,000,000-year life, like a climber driving spikes into rock, and the spikes were holding. The humans had learned to fight it. That was the thing the records could never have shown, because the records were of the people who went in early, before anyone knew the rules. These ships had been in the dark for 1,000,000 years, and 1,000,000 years is a long time to study an enemy, and the enemy had taught them. They had figured out that the threadless could only take what was loosely held, so they had learned to hold themselves tightly. They had learned to be so certain of their own existence, so fiercely present, that the unmaking could find no slack to pull. It was not a weapon in the way Ossian understood weapons. It was a refusal turned into a wall. Morrow's Keep held the line, and into the gap it bought, the rest of the fleet began to work. Ossian had thought the gray ships were silent. He had been wrong. As the engagement opened, the fleet began to sing, or the nearest thing to it, a layered braid of signal that flowed between the 240 hulls, faster than any conversation. He realized he was watching them coordinate. Every ship was sharing its certainty with every other ship, a vast, redundant web of mutual insistence, so that if the threadless pulled hard enough to start loosening one ship's thread, the other 239 would pour their own certainty into the gap and hold their sister in place. They were not just a fleet, they were a single mind made of memory, and the memory was their armor. The threadless recoiled, the smear pulled back from Morrow's keep, and for the first time, the instruments showed something Ossian had not dared hope for. They showed the thing in the dark being hurt. Not hurt as a body is hurt as a lie is hurt. When it meets a truth it cannot bend around. Wherever the fleet's certainty touched the edge of the threadless, the smear thinned, and the stars behind it came back, one by one, like lamps being relit in a house that had been dark a long time. Hesso made a low sound that the Tirok make only at funerals and births. "It is afraid of them," he said. "Chronicler, are you writing this?" "It is afraid of them. I am writing it," Ossian said. And he was. The battle, if it could be called that, did not have the shape of any battle in the archive. There were no broadsides, no swift kills, no wreckage. There was a slow and terrible pressure, the threadless leaning its whole weight of unexistence against the lattice of gray ships, and the lattice leaning back, and neither giving, and the stars between them flickering as causality itself was fought over inch by inch. Ossian watched a region of space where two of the human ships, named in the traffic as Saltmarsh and Greylight, held a section of the line, and he watched the threadless try a thing it had perhaps not tried in a long time. It reached past them. It did not attack the ships. It attacked their past. It tried to reach back along the thread of Saltmarsh's existence and pull loose the moment, a million years gone, when Saltmarsh had first been built, so that the ship would unravel not from the present, but from the root. And Ossian watched the fleet answer that too. Because they had a memory of it. Greylight, its sister ship, held the memory of Saltmarsh's building. Every ship in the fleet held the memory of every other ship's building, a deliberate redundancy, a vow they had made to each other in the dark. You cannot erase what is remembered by another. The threadless reached for Saltmarsh's birth, and found Greylight standing in the doorway of that long-ago moment, holding it, insisting on it, and the unmaking slid off the memory like water off stone. Ossian understood, then, why the message had said, "Hold your memory." It was not a request for sympathy, it was a tactic. The fleet was teaching the station, in real time, the only thing that worked. To survive the threadless, you had to be remembered. The more minds held you, the harder you were to unmake, and the fleet, 240 ships strong and 1,000,000 years certain, was the most thoroughly remembered thing in the history of the galaxy, because every one of them remembered all the others, completely, all the time, without rest. That was their weapon, that was the whole of it. They had armored themselves in each other. The threadless tried a third thing. It went for Candlewake. Ossian saw it on the readout before he understood it. The smear gathered, drew itself in from the whole length of the line, abandoning its attacks on Morrow's Keep and Saltmarsh and Greylight, concentrating into a single black spear of unexistence, and it drove that spear at the lead ship, the one with the dark towers, the one whose markings were the oldest of all. It struck Candlewake with everything it was, the full weight of 1,000,000 years of hunger, and the station's instruments went mad. The clock on the wall stopped. The air in the listening ring tasted, for a moment, of a season none of the Tirak could name, and Candlewake's hull, on the readout, began to thin. The lead ship was being unmade. Hesso was on his feet. The junior watchers had stopped breathing. Ossian's hand hovered over the recorder, frozen, because he did not want to write what came next, did not want to be the one who recorded the moment the fleet that had stood in front of them came apart. And then the fleet sang. All 239 other ships, at once, poured their certainty into Candlewake. The web of mutual memory that had been spread across the whole line collapsed inward, every hull abandoning its own defense to hold up the flagship, and the readout showed the most extraordinary thing Ossian had ever measured. Candlewake stopped thinning, then it thickened, then it began to push back, and the black spear of the threadless, which had been driving inward, began to slow, and stop, and bend. The Tirak instruments, honest to the last, showed Ossian exactly what was happening, and he wrote it down with a hand that finally, fully understood. The threadless had made a mistake. By concentrating everything on Candlewake, it had stopped attacking the other ships, and the other ships, freed of having to defend themselves, had put every gram of their certainty into the one place the enemy had chosen to stand. The whole million-year memory of the fleet, undivided, met the whole hunger of the Threadless at a single point, and the memory was heavier. The black spear shattered. It did not explode. There was no fire, no shockwave. It simply lost the argument. The smear that had been the Threadless came apart into the dark it had come from. Not killed. Ossian could see that much. Not killed, but driven back, dispersed, beaten in this one exchange the way a wave is beaten by a seawall, gathering itself again somewhere out in the unmade to come back changed. But for now, for this hour, the stars behind Candlewake were whole, and the clock on Ossian's wall began, very slowly, to tick again. The listening ring of Caro Deep was utterly silent. Then the junior watcher who had aged and unaged, a young Tyrrek named Pell, began to make the funeral and birth sound, low in her chest, and one by one the others took it up, until the whole ring of frightened watchers was singing the oldest sound their people had, the sound for things too large to speak, and Ossian Vale, chronicler, found that he was making it too, even as he wrote. The signal came again from Candlewake, and it was the same tired, even voice, and it said, "That was the first wave. There will be more. We have an hour, perhaps two, before it gathers itself. We would like to use that hour to talk to you, if you will let us. We have been away a long time, and we have questions, and I think you have answers we will not enjoy." Hesso looked at the chronicler. Ossian looked at the station master. "Open the channel," Hesso said. "Let them speak." And then, more quietly, so that only Ossian heard it, "Be gentle with them. When they ask the year, they do not know yet what they have lost." Ossian opened the channel. He keyed his recorder to capture every word, and he said, in the formal speech of his people, the speech reserved for first contact and for funerals, the only two occasions the Tirok considered grave enough to warrant it, and it had never once occurred to any of them that those two occasions might be the same one. "This is Caro Deep," he said. "We hear you. We have heard you for 1,000,000 years, though we did not know we were listening. Welcome home." There was a long pause on the channel, long enough that Ossian feared the translation had failed, and then the voice from Candlewake, the tired, even voice, said one word, and the translation engine rendered it, and Ossian wrote it down, and it was the heaviest word he had ever recorded. It said, "Home." Just that. A question and an answer and a wound, all in a single syllable, from a fleet that had just realized, in the space between one word and the next, that the word it had carried for 1,000,000 years through the dark might no longer mean anything at all. The lull did not last. 8 minutes after the first wave broke, the instruments of Caro Deep caught the Threadless doing something new, and Ossian, watching the readouts crawl, felt the dread come back colder than before. The smear at the edge of the gap had not regathered into a single mass. It had split. Where there had been one stain across the stars, there were now 7 smaller ones, each spread thin and probing at a different point of the fleet's lattice. Testing, the way a flood tests a wall for the weakest brick. The thing in the dark had learned that a single spear could be met by a single concentration of certainty. So it had stopped being a single thing. "It is dividing," Hesso said quietly. "Chronicler, can a thing like that divide?" Ossian watched the 7 probes drift along the line and understood the answer before he could say it. It could divide, because it was never really one thing to begin with. The Threadless was not a creature with a body. It was a condition, a wrongness in the weave of time, and a wrongness could be in 7 places as easily as one, because it had no flesh to split, only hunger to spread. And 7 smaller hungers were harder to fight than one large one, because the fleet's whole strategy was concentration, and you cannot concentrate against an enemy that is everywhere at once. The fleet answered, and the answer taught Ossian more about them in 90 seconds than the first wave had taught him in 9 minutes. They did not try to concentrate, they did the opposite. The 240 gray ships, with the same eerie practiced unity they did everything, broke their tight lattice into 7 smaller lattices, each one a self-contained web of mutual memory, each one assigned to meet one of the 7 probes. The geometry engine of Caro Deep struggled to keep up with the Reformation, and Ossian realized he was watching a fleet that had a maneuver ready for this. that had practiced dividing to meet a divided enemy 10,000 times in the dark, that had a name in its traffic for this exact formation. The translation engine caught the name and rendered it. They called it the Sevenfold Watch. They had a name for it. They had faced 7 probes before. They had faced everything before, in a million years, and they had a name and a drill for all of it. And the drills were so old that the humans performing them now were the descendants of the ones who had invented them. The 7 probes pressed, and the 7 lattices held, and for a few minutes the line was steady. But Ossian, watching the honest numbers, saw a thing the humans surely saw too. 7 smaller lattices were each thinner than the one great lattice had been. The fleet was spread. If the Threadless gathered 6 of its 7 probes back into one and threw them at a single divided lattice, that lattice might not hold. The enemy was not trying to break the line. It was trying to make the line spread itself too thin to defend, and then strike the thinnest part. It is patient, Ossian wrote, his stylus moving fast. It does not want to win this exchange. It wants to win the next one. It is spending these probes to learn where we are weak. And then the Threadless did exactly what he feared. 6 of the 7 smears went still, holding their lattices in place, and the 7th gathered, drawing in mass from somewhere out in the unmade, swelling, concentrating, until it was larger than the whole first wave had been, and it drove at the section of the line held by the smallest of the 7 human lattices, a cluster of only 14 ships near the upper arc, ships the traffic named as the Marrow Group. 14 ships against a hunger that had just eaten a million years of patience to grow. "Hold," came the voice from Candlewake, calm as still water even now. "Marrow Group, hold. Help is coming. Caro Deep, if you have ever wanted to matter, this is the moment. Hold them with us. Remember the Marrow Group, 14 ships. Write their names." And Ossian, who did not know their names, learned them in the space of a breath, as the fleet poured them across the channel, 14 ships a million years old, and he wrote every one of them down as fast as his hand could move. And the writing was a wall, and the 14 ships did not thin, because 212 Tirek, and a chronicler, and an archive 19 generations deep, had just decided, all at once, that the Marrow Group existed, and would go on existing, and there was no slack anywhere for the dark to pull. The 7th smear broke against 14 ships and a station full of strangers, and fell back, and the 7-fold watch held, and the lull came again, longer this time, the Threadless, pulling all 7 of itself back into the deep dark to think. "It thinks like we do," Hesso breathed. "That is the horror of it. It has been studying them as long as they have been studying it. They know each other. This is not a beast and a soldier. This is 2 old enemies who have nothing left in the universe but each other." Ossian wrote that down too, because it was true, and because he had begun to understand that the conversation about to happen on the channel was not a pause in the battle. It was part of it. The fleet needed to know the year, needed to know what they had lost, because a soldier fights differently when the soldier knows whether there is anything left to fight for. The humans were about to ask the question that would decide whether they ran or stood, and the answer would shape the war. While the channel was still settling, the Threadless tried one last thing in the lull, and it was the most frightening of all, because it did not come for the ships, and it did not come for the bodies of the Watchers. It came for the archive. Ossian saw it first as a fault in the records, a page in the deep memory of Caro Deep, a page that held the registry of a comet his great-grandfather had logged 800 years before, began to go blank. Then another. The dark had found a thread it had not thought to pull before. The archive was the station's mind, the long memory that made the Tirok what they were, and it was held in old crystal and older habit, and some of it, the oldest of it, was held in only one place. A thing held in only one place has slack, and the Threadless, reaching past the fleet and past the bodies of the Watchers, had found the one part of Caro Deep that was not yet wrapped in the web, and it had begun, quietly, to read the station's memory backward into nothing. "It is in the archive," Ossian shouted, and the horror in his own voice surprised him, because he had not known until that moment how much the archive was the thing he loved. "Master, it is unmaking the archive. It is taking the old logs. It is taking the records that only exist once." Hesso went gray at the rim. "Those records are 19 generations deep," he said. "If they go, We do not just forget them. We were never the people who wrote them. We become a smaller people, a younger people, a people who never kept the watch. It is trying to unmake us by unmaking what we remember. And the fleet, on the channel, heard, and the fleet answered, and the answer was the thing that bound the two peoples together for good. "Copy it to us," said Adira Voss, instantly, no hesitation at all. "Every record. Open your archive to the fleet, and let 240 ships read it at once. We cannot hold a thing we do not know, but the moment we know it, it has 240 more places to live, and the dark cannot pull a thread that many hands are holding. Hurry, chronicler. Read us your archive. Read us everything. We will remember it with you." It should not have worked. The archive of Caro Deep was vast, the accumulated logbook of 19 generations of patient watchers, and there was no time to copy it, the slow, careful way. But the fleet did not need it copied. They needed it witnessed. And so Ossian Vale did the thing that no chronicler before him had ever done, the thing that broke every rule of his careful trade, and saved everything that mattered. He opened the whole archive at once, and he read it aloud across the channel, not word by word, but all of it together. The entire memory of his people poured out in a single torrent of signal, and 240 gray ships took it in and held it. Every comet, and every drifting hulk, and every cold beacon, and every slow turning of the stars, 800 years of one watcher's logs, and the 18 generations behind him, all of it, witnessed now by a fleet that had spent 1,000,000 years learning to never let a remembered thing be lost. The blank pages stopped spreading. Then they filled back in, because a thing remembered by 240 ships, and an old station, and a chronicler who would not stop reading, is a thing the dark cannot reach. The threadless pulled at the archive and found, where there had been slack, a rope so thick it could not get its grip around it. The oldest records of the Tirok, the ones that had existed in only one place for 800 years, now existed in 241, and they were safe, and they would stay safe, because the fleet would carry them now, as surely as it carried its own dead. Ossian sat back, shaking, the last of the archive still streaming out across the channel, and he understood that something had changed that could never change back. The Tirok and the Long Vigil were no longer two peoples who had met an hour ago. They were one memory now, braided together, each holding what the other could not hold alone. The humans held the Tirok's 800 years of comets. The Tirok held the humans' 1,000,000 years of names. Neither could be unmade while the other lived, and that, Ossian realized, was the deepest kind of alliance there was, deeper than any treaty, older than any oath. They had agreed to remember each other. "It cannot reach the archive now," Hesso breathed, watching the pages fill. "Chronicler, they are holding our memory. They are holding the whole of us." "And we are holding the whole of them," Ossian said, and he found that he was weeping, and he did not stop reading, because the reading was the thing now, the reading was the wall, and he would read for as long as the dark wanted to listen. "We traded memories, Master. They will never forget us now, and we will never forget them. Whatever happens in the next hour, that is done, that is permanent. They are part of us, and we are part of them, and the dark made it so by trying to take it from us." The lull stretched on, and the threadless gathered itself for the last time in the deep dark, and the two peoples of Caro Deep used the minutes they had been given to become, quietly and completely, a single thing that the dark could not divide. And when at last the fleet sent its image across the channel, and the first human face Ossian had ever seen appeared on the station's main display, he looked at it not as a stranger, but as kin, because they had already done the thing that makes kin out of strangers. They had promised to remember each other, and they had meant it, and the dark itself had witnessed the promise, and been unable to break it. The face that came onto the station's main display was the first human face Ossian Vale had ever seen, and it was older than he expected, and younger than it should have been. The fleet sent an image with the channel, a courtesy, and the translation engine framed it. The human was a tall, narrow figure in gray, with close-cropped dark hair gone iron at the edges, and a long, calm face marked by a scar that, like the scars on the hulls, did not look like any wound Ossian could name. The human's eyes were the strange part. They were patient in a way that no eyes, that had only lived one lifetime, could be patient. The being introduced itself in the formal traffic as the voice of the Long Vigil, and gave a name, and the translation engine rendered the name as Adira Voss, and added a marker that Ossian did not understand at first. The marker said the name was inherited. Adira Voss was not a person. It was an office. A role passed hand to hand, down the length of the fleet's exile, the way the name of the chronicler was passed down the watchers of Cairo Deep. The being on the screen was perhaps the 4,000th person to hold the name. Ossian found this comforting in a way he could not explain, until he realized it was because it meant the humans understood, as the Tirok understood, that a job could outlive a life, and that some duties were too important to die with the one who held them. "We thank you for standing down your weapons," Adira Voss said. The voice was even and low and tired, the same voice that had spoken from Candlewake. "And we thank you for the welcome. It was kind. I do not think you understand yet how kind, and I do not want you to have to. So let me ask the question plainly, and you may answer it plainly, and we will bear whatever the answer is, because we have borne worse." Ossian waited. "How long?" Adira Voss said. "By your reckoning, by any reckoning you trust. How long have we been in the dark?" Hesso, the station master, stepped into the frame of the channel, because some things should not be said by a chronicler, but by the one who holds the post. "The Tirok do not lie," Hesso said slowly. "It is the one thing our whole civilization is built not to do, because we live at the edge of a place that eats the truth, and a lie here is the same as helping the dark. So I will not soften this. Your registry date is 1,040,000 years old, give or take a margin our instruments place at 400 years. You have been gone, voice of the long vigil, longer than my species has had a written word." The human face did not change. That was the thing that struck Ossian hardest, harder than the number itself. The face did not crumple, did not break, did not look away. It simply took the blow, the way the hull of Morrow's Keep had taken the threadless, holding itself fiercely in place against a thing that wanted to unmake it. "1,000,000 years, Adira Voss said. "We suspected. The stars had moved too far. The constellations we set out under are gone. We have been recalculating our position for the last 900 years of the journey home, and refusing to believe the answer the math kept giving us. Thank you for confirming it. It is easier to bear a thing once it is named." Then the human asked the second question, and it was the one Ossian had been dreading, because there was no kind way to answer it either. "And our people," Adira Voss said, "Earth, the worlds we left to defend, are they?" Hesso was quiet for a long moment. "We do not know," he said at last, and it was the truth. "We are not Earth's children. We do not know your makers. 1,000,000 years is deep even for us, and the species who taught us to write knew nothing of you, and the species who taught them knew nothing either. If your people lived on, voice of the long vigil, they did not pass this way, or if they did, they passed so long ago that even the dark has forgotten them. I am sorry. I would give you a better answer, if a better answer were true." And here was the thing that Ossian wrote down with the greatest care of his entire life, because it was the thing that changed everything, the thing that turned a sad story into a different kind of story altogether. Adira Voss smiled. It was a small smile, and a tired one, and it was not the smile of someone who had given up. "We did not turn back," the human said, and the voice was suddenly not tired at all, but something else, something Ossian's instruments could not measure, and his language could not hold. "We were sent out to keep the threadless from reaching the inhabited worlds. That was the mission. Stand between the unmaking and everything that could be unmade, and hold, for as long as holding was needed. We did not know it would be 1,000,000 years. We did not know we would never go back. But the mission was never, go home. The mission was, keep it from following us home. And voice of Cairo Deep, hear me clearly, because this is the part that matters. We have kept it. For 1,000,000 years, in the dark, where no one could see us, and no one would ever know, we have kept that thing away from every living world it ever wanted, including, it seems, yours." Ossian felt the room go still around him. "You did not know," Adira Voss said, gently now. "You wrote down comets and drifting hulks, and the slow turning of stars, and you never wrote down the thing we were holding back, because you never saw it, because we never let it through. 1,000,000 years of watchers at this station, and not one of you ever had to record the day the dark came for your worlds, because we stood where you could not see us, and made sure that day never came. You are alive to welcome us home, because we never came home. Do you understand what I am telling you? We did not fail. We are the most successful military operation in the history of anything that has ever lived. We just had to disappear to do it. Hesso sat down very slowly. The Tirok archive, Ossian thought. The saddest documents in our possession, the blank records of the ones who went into the dark and were forgotten. They were not records of failure. They were records of a watch, so perfect, that the watched over never knew they were being watched. The blankness was not the dark erasing the heroes. The blankness was the heroes succeeding so completely that no disaster was ever written down to mark their work. The greatest deeds in the history of the galaxy had left no trace, precisely because they had worked, and a thing that works leaves no wound to remember it by. Ossian put down his stylus. For the first time in 40 years of chronicling, he did not know what to write, because the thing he was witnessing was too large for the shape of any sentence he had been taught. Then he picked the stylus up again, because the not knowing was exactly why someone had to. There was more, Adira Voss said, and now the tiredness came back into the voice, and under it, something harder. The threadless followed us out. You saw that. We hoped, when we found the gap that led back to the living stars, that we might slip through and leave it lost in the dark. We were wrong. It has learned to follow a thread, even a thread it cannot unmake, and it followed ours all the way here. So now there is a choice, and it is not ours alone to make, because it is your station and your stars at risk, and we will not decide it for you the way the dark decided for us. What choice? Hesso said. We can run again, Adira Voss said simply. We can lead it back into the unmade and keep running. Another 1,000,000 years if that is what it takes, and your worlds will stay safe, and you will go on writing down comets, and never know how close it came. That is one choice, and it is the choice we have made every day for longer than you can imagine, and we are very, very good at it. Or, the human said, and stopped. Or, Hesso said. Or, we finish it, Adira Voss said. Here, now, while it is hurt and gathering, and not yet whole. We have never once in 1,000,000 years had it cornered the way it is cornered now, with a wall of living stars at its back, and a fleet at its front, and nowhere left to spread. We have heard it tonight, worse than we have heard it in 10,000 years. We could end it, but to end it we would have to do a thing we have never been willing to do, because it puts your station in the path of it, and 1,000,000 years of keeping you safe makes me reluctant to spend you now in the last hour, so I will not choose. I am asking. Caro Deep, station at the edge of the gap, watchers of the long memory, do we run and keep you safe and ignorant, or do we stand, here, with you, and try to end the thing that has hunted us since before your sun was warm? The channel went quiet. Ossian looked at Hesso, and Hesso looked at the ring of watchers, the 212 frightened Tirok who had spent their lives recording a galaxy, and had just learned that the most important thing in it had been happening just out of sight the whole time. And Ossian saw, on every pale and ancient face, the same answer forming, the same answer that he felt rising in his own chest, an answer that surprised him with its certainty. Pell, the junior watcher, the one whose hand had aged and unaged, said it first, in a small clear voice that carried across the whole ring. They stood in front of us, Pell said, when they did not have to. When they had every reason to run and never look back, they turned and put themselves between us and the dark, 4 minutes after meeting us. She looked at Hesso. Master, we are the people who do not look away. It is the only thing we have ever been. We do not get to ask them to stand alone now, not after 1,000,000 years, not after tonight. Hesso closed his eyes. Then he opened them, and he turned to the channel, and he gave the answer in the formal speech, the speech for first contact and for funerals, which were, Ossian now understood completely, the same grave occasion after all. We stand, Hesso said. Caro Deep stands with the long vigil. We have no fleet and no guns that will matter to a thing like that. But we have the one weapon you told us mattered. We have memory. 212 of us, and an archive 19 generations deep, and instruments that do not lie. Tell us how to hold a thing in place by remembering it, voice of the long vigil, and we will remember your ship so hard that the dark will never pull one thread of you loose. We will not look away. It is the only promise we know how to keep. On the screen, the 4,000th person to carry the name Adira Voss bowed its head, and when it raised it again, the patient ancient eyes were wet, and the tired voice was steady, and it said the thing that Ossian would carve, later, over the door of the station archive, where every watcher who came after would read it on their first day. Then we are not alone anymore, Adira Voss said. For the first time in 1,000,000 years, we are not alone. Thank you, Caro Deep. Now let us teach you how to remember, and then let us go and finish this together. They had 51 minutes, and the humans spent the first 9 of them teaching a species older than their own civilization how to fight a thing that ate time. The lesson came across the channel as a flood of structured signal, and the Tirok took it the way the Tirok took everything, by writing it down and passing it hand to hand. Ossian watched his people transform in front of him. The same watchers who had stood frozen an hour ago were now bent over their instruments with the fierce focus of their whole long heritage, because this, at last, was a thing they were built for. They were the keepers of memory. They had been keeping memory for 19 generations, without ever knowing that one day, memory would be a weapon. The principle was simple, and the practice was not. A thing remembered by many minds is hard to unmake, Adira Voss explained, because the threadless can only pull loose what is loosely held, and a memory held in many places at once has no single thread to pull. The fleet had survived 1,000,000 years by remembering each other. Now they would extend the web. Every instrument in Caro Deep, every recorder, every watcher's trained and disciplined mind would be turned toward the gray ships and used to hold them in place. 212 more witnesses, an archive 19 generations deep, suddenly pressed into the line. Ossian's task, as chronicler, was the heaviest. He was to record the engagement as it happened, in real time, in the honest, unbreakable record of the Tirok, because a thing written down in a record that does not lie is a thing held more firmly than any censor can hold it. His writing was a wall, his stylus was a gun. He had spent 40 years thinking himself the least important being on the station, the one who only watched, and now the voice of a 1,000,000-year fleet was telling him that the watching was the war. He understood, finally, what his ancestors had built Caro Deep to do, even though they had never known it themselves. They had built a place that refused to forget, at the exact edge of a place that forced forgetting. They had built, without knowing, the perfect ally for the long vigil. It had only taken 1,000,000 years for the two halves of the answer to find each other. 11 minutes left. The threadless came back, and it came back changed. The instruments showed it first as a wrongness at the edge of the gap, the stars going gray, the constellations behind it ceasing to be constellations. But it was larger now, and worse, and it had learned from the exchange that had broken its spear. It did not gather into a single point this time. It spread itself thin across the entire mouth of the gap, a vast flat sheet of unexistence, and it came at the whole fleet at once. Every ship attacked at the same instant, so that no ship could be abandoned to pour its certainty into another. It had understood the fleet's tactic. It was trying to make the web fail by attacking every node of it simultaneously. It was, Ossian realized with a cold clarity, an intelligent thing and a patient one, and it had 1,000,000 years of studying the long vigil exactly as the long vigil had 1,000,000 years of studying it. This was not a beast. This was the oldest war in the galaxy. Two enemies who knew each other better than they knew anything else, meeting for the last time at the edge of a station full of strangers who had decided to weigh in. "Hold," said Adira Voss across the channel, calm as still water. "Caro Deep, this is the hour. Hold us. Every ship. Hold every ship. Do not let it loosen even one." And Caro Deep held. Ossian had never been prouder of anything. The 212 watchers turned their instruments and their minds, and their 19 generations of trained attention on the gray ships, and they held. Pell held Morrow's Keep, calling its name and its shape and its history into the record over and over. Hesso held Candlewake. The geometry engine held the whole formation's structure in perfect mathematical certainty. And Ossian wrote, faster than he had ever written, a continuous unbroken record of every ship's existence, every name, every scar, every gun, pinning each one to the page so the dark could not pull it loose. The readouts showed the threadless meet a wall it had never met before. For 1,000,000 years it had faced 240 minds holding each other. Now it faced 240, plus 212, plus an archive, plus a station built across 19 generations for the single purpose of not forgetting, and the difference was not small. The difference was the difference between a wall and a wall with a mountain behind it. The smear pressed against the fleet, and the fleet did not thin. It did not thin anywhere. Wherever the threadless reached for slack, it found a Tirok instrument, or a Tirok mind, or a line in Ossian's record, holding the thread tight, and there was no slack, anywhere, in the whole line. "It is not working for it," Hesso breathed. Chronicler. "It is not working." But the threadless was patient, and it was old, and it had one more thing to try. It stopped attacking the ships. The instruments showed the change, and Ossian's blood went cold, because he understood it before the alarm even sounded. The threadless had measured the line, found it unbreakable, and made a decision that only a truly ancient enemy would make. If it could not unmake the fleet, it would unmake the thing holding the fleet. It turned, all at once, away from the 240 gray ships, and it threw the entire flat sheet of its unexistence at Caro Deep, at the station, at the watchers, at the new wall that had made the old wall unbreakable. It came for the Tirok. There was no time to run, and nowhere to run to. The smear crossed the gap in the space of 3 heartbeats, and struck the asteroid, and the listening ring of Caro Deep, the hollowed mountain that 19 generations had carved, began to unravel. Ossian felt it in his own body, in the wrongness of it, the way his memories of the morning suddenly had holes, the way he could not for a moment recall his own mother's face, the way the record on the page in front of him began to fade as the ink itself was pulled toward never having been written. The station's clock spun. A whole section of the outer ring, and the 6 watchers in it, simply began to thin, to become a thing that had not been built, that had not been crewed, that had not existed. And the long vigil turned. Ossian saw it on the failing readout, saw it through the holes opening in his own mind, and it was the thing he would hold on to for the rest of his life, the thing he would remember when the dark tried to take everything else. The gray fleet, freed from defending itself the instant the threadless turned away, did exactly what Caro Deep had done for it. It poured everything into the station. 240 ships, 1,000,000 years certain, threw the entire weight of their memory at the little asteroid full of strangers, and held it in place. They remembered Caro Deep. They remembered the 6 watchers in the thinning ring, though they had never met them, holding their existence by sheer insistence, the way Greylight had held Saltmarsh's birth. They remembered the station's 19 generations. They remembered Ossian Vale, chronicler, his name and his face and his 40 years of writing down comets, and they held him so hard that the holes in his mind stopped spreading and began, slowly, to close. He felt it happen. He felt a fleet older than his species reach into his unraveling memory and hold his mother's face in place for him until he could hold it himself again. The outer ring stopped thinning. The 6 watchers solidified, gasping, alive, remembered. The ink on Ossian's page darkened back to black. And now the threadless was caught. Ossian saw the trap close, and he understood that it had been a trap all along, and that the fleet had known, and that the asking had been real, but the readiness had been planned. By throwing itself at Caro Deep, the threadless had turned its back on the long vigil, and now the long vigil was holding the station, and the station was still holding the fleet, and the whole vast web of mutual memory had snapped shut around the enemy with the threadless on the inside of it. For the first time in 1,000,000 years, the unmaking was the thing surrounded, the thing remembered, on every side, by minds that would not let go. "End it!" Hesso roared into the channel, on his feet, his old voice cracking. "End it! Long vigil, we have it. We have it held. End it now." "Now," said Adira Voss, very quietly, Candlewake, "all ships. Now." And the fleet did the thing it had never been able to do in 1,000,000 years, because it had never before had a wall of living memory at the enemy's back to stop it from spreading. It stopped defending. Every one of the 240 ships at the same instant dropped its guard and turned its full certainty from holding itself to attacking the threadless. And the only reason they dared was that Caro Deep was holding them now. 212 watchers, and an archive, and a chronicler writing without pause, holding the whole fleet in place so the fleet did not need to hold itself. The humans spent their entire defense in a single offensive breath, and they could only do it because someone else, at last, had their backs. The instruments could barely render what happened next. The fleet's certainty, all of it, a million years of fierce undivided presence, poured into the Threadless from 240 directions, and the station's memory poured in from behind, and the enemy that had spent a million years unmaking others was, for the first time, made to face the question it asked everything else. Are you held tightly enough to exist? And the Threadless, which had never been remembered by anyone, which was loved by nothing and recalled by no one, which had spent its whole long life as a thing that erased, and was never itself erased, discovered that it had no thread anyone was holding. It had no certainty of its own. It had only ever borrowed existence by stealing it. But it did not die easily, and it did not die without trying the cruelest thing it had left. In the instant before the end, the Threadless did the one thing that no instrument of Caro Deep had prepared Ossian to read, and the one thing the fleet had perhaps dreaded for a million years. It stopped reaching forward. It reached back. With the last of its borrowed existence, surrounded and held and unable to spread, it drove its whole remaining weight not at the present, but at the deepest root of all, at the single moment, a million years gone, when the long vigil had first set out, when the fleet was new, and the crews were young, and the mission was a thing of decades, and not of forever. It tried to unmake the launch itself. If the fleet had never set out, the Threadless reasoned in whatever way a wrongness reasons, then it had never been fought, never been cornered, never been here at all, and the whole night would unravel backward into a war that no one had ever won. Ossian saw the readouts reach back through time, and felt the station shudder around him as the past itself was pulled, and for one terrible heartbeat, the fleet on his screen began to grow faint, all 240 ships at once, thinning not from the present, but from the root, as the moment of their birth came loose in the dark. And the fleet could not hold that moment alone, because they had not been there to remember it. The crews who launched the long vigil were a million years dead. There was no one left alive who remembered the day the fleet set out. No one human. But the Tyrrhic had an archive 19 generations deep, and in the hours and days since the fleet's arrival, Ossian Vale had been writing the history of the long vigil into that record, and the very first thing he had written, the very first fact he had pinned to the page in his honest, unbreakable hand, was the registry date. The day the fleet set out, 1,040,000 years ago, give or take 400. He had written it down. It was in the archive. It was remembered. "Hold the launch," Ossian shouted, and he did not wait for the fleet to understand him. He turned the whole memory of Caro Deep, at the one moment the humans could not reach, the moment of their own beginning, and he held it the way the fleet had held everything, by refusing, by insisting, by writing it down again right then in the middle of the battle. The date, the launch, the day the long vigil first sailed into the dark. Here it is. It happened. It is written. It is remembered. You cannot pull it loose because we are holding it for them. The Tyrrhic held the birth of a fleet that no living human had witnessed, and the launch held. The fleet, which had been thinning, thickened. The day a million years gone, the day no human survived to remember, was remembered now by a species that had not even existed when it happened, held in place by an archive built for exactly this, and a chronicler who had, without knowing why, written down the one fact that would save them. The root held. The fleet came back, solid, whole, every ship of it, anchored to its own beginning by the memory of strangers. And now the Threadless had nothing left. It had spent its last reach on the past, and the past had held, and there was no more dark to retreat into, and no more time to steal, and no slack anywhere in the whole weave of the universe for it to pull. It had no certainty of its own, and now it had no past to unmake, and no future to flee into, and it was held, completely, on every side and at every moment, by minds that would not let go. And the fleet, and the station, with one vast act of shared and stubborn memory, simply stopped agreeing that it was there. The Threadless came apart, and the way it came apart was the strangest thing Ossian Vale ever recorded, because it did not end the way a thing ends. It ended the way a thing that was never quite real stops being agreed upon. The smear across the stars did not burn or burst. It thinned, The way the station had thinned, the way Morrow's keep had nearly thinned. But for the Threadless, there was no fleet to hold it, and no archive to remember it, and no chronicler writing its name down to keep it on the page. It had spent 1,000,000 years making sure that nothing remembered the things it unmade, and in doing so, it had taught the whole galaxy the one lesson that finally killed it. To exist near the unmade, you had to be remembered. And no one, in all the long dark, had ever once chosen to remember the Threadless. It thinned, and the stars came back behind it, one by one, lamps relit in a house that had been dark for 1,000,000 years, and then there was a last moment where the instruments of Caro Deep showed a thing that was almost nothing, a thread with no one holding either end, and then there was a place in the sky where the Threadless was not, and where, Ossian's honest instruments now insisted, it had never been at all. The dark place at the edge of the Marin Gap was just dark now, empty dark, the ordinary, harmless dark between stars. The unmade was unmade. For a long moment, nobody on Caro Deep moved or spoke. The clock on the wall ticked, steadily, in the right direction, and the sound of it was the most beautiful thing Ossian had ever heard. The 6 watchers in the outer ring were whole. The ink on his page was black. His mother's face was in his mind where it belonged. The galaxy had a hole in it where a horror used to be, and the hole was simply sky. Then the channel opened, and the tired, even voice of Adira Voss came across it, and it was not tired anymore. "It is gone," the voice said, and there was wonder in it, a thing Ossian had not expected to hear from a being 4,000 lifetimes old. "We checked it 3 times. We do not believe it either, but it is gone. The Threadless is gone. We followed it for 1,000,000 years, and we never once made it flinch, and tonight, with you, we ended it. Caro Deep, Watchers of the Long Memory, we could not have done this without you. I want that written down, chronicler, in your record that does not lie. The Long Vigil could not have done this alone. After 1,000,000 years of being alone, the thing that finally beat the dark was not being alone." Ossian wrote it down. His hand was steady, and his eyes were not. Then the questions came, the practical ones, the ones that come after every battle when the survivors look around and realize they have to go on living. Hesso asked the first of them, gently, because he had been dreading it through the whole engagement. "What will you do now?" Hesso said. "Voice of the Long Vigil. Your mission is finished. The thing you were sent to hold back is gone. Your makers are 1,000,000 years dust, and the worlds you set out to defend are names no one remembers. You are the most successful soldiers in the history of anything that ever lived, and you have nowhere to go home to. What does a fleet do when it has won a war that the whole universe forgot it was fighting?" There was a long silence on the channel. When Adira Voss answered, the voice was quiet and certain, and Ossian understood that the answer had been decided long ago, somewhere in the dark, on one of the 10,000 nights the fleet had not turned back. "We are not soldiers anymore," Adira Voss said. "We were soldiers because there was a thing that needed fighting. There is no longer a thing that needs fighting, so we will be the next thing. We have spent 1,000,000 years learning the only skill that matters at the edge of the dark. We know how to remember. We know how to hold a thing in place by refusing to forget it. That is not a weapon, in the end. It is a way of caring for something, and there is a great deal in this galaxy that needs caring for, that needs someone to remember it so hard that it cannot be lost." The human paused, and then said the thing that turned the whole night, finally, all the way around, from an ending into a beginning. "You have an archive," Adira Voss said, 19 generations deep, the longest unbroken record in this arm of the sky. And we have a fleet that has watched the galaxy from the outside for 1,000,000 years, and seen every star move, and remembered all of it, because remembering was how we stayed alive. Ossian Vale, chronicler, I think your archive and our memory belong together. I think the Tirok and the Long Vigil have been doing the same job, on opposite sides of the same dark, for longer than either of us knew. You refuse to forget. We refuse to be unmade. They are the same refusal. Let us join them." Ossian looked at Hesso. Hesso looked at the ring of watchers. And Pell, the junior watcher, the one whose hand had aged and unaged, who had spoken first when it mattered before, spoke first again. "Stay," Pell said simply. "Voice of the Long Vigil, you came home tonight after all. You just had to find a different home than the one you set out from. Stay. We will make room. We have been keeping a watch at the edge of the dark for 19 generations, and we never knew what we were watching for. We were watching for you. Stay, and we will remember you, and you will remember us. And between the two of us, nothing will ever be lost at this edge of the sky again." On the screen, the 4,000th person to carry the name Adira Voss wept, openly now, and did not hide it, and the patient, ancient eyes that had watched a million years of dark looked at the little asteroid station, full of strangers, who had become, in the space of 1 hour, the only family the fleet had left. "We accept," said the voice of the long vigil. "We will stay." The gray fleet stood down. Ossian watched it happen on the readout, and it was, in its quiet way, more moving than the battle had been. The 240 ships, which had held their fierce battle formation for 1,000,000 years, which had not relaxed their guns or their vigilance for longer than the Tyrrek had existed, slowly, ship by ship, let the formation go soft. They drifted out of the deep lattice they had held for 10,000 generations of human life, and into something looser, something that was not a battle line, something that had not been needed in 1,000,000 years. They spread out around Cairo Deep like a city settling around a hearth. For the first time in 1,000,000 years, the long vigil was not on watch. It took the Tyrrek the better part of a year to begin to understand what had come to live among them. The fleet of the long vigil was not, it turned out, only ships. The gray hulls held the descendants of the crews who had set out 1,000,000 years before, generations beyond counting, a whole civilization that had grown up entirely in the dark, with no sky but the unmade, and no purpose but the watch. They had songs that were older than any song the Tyrrek knew. They had a way of remembering their dead so completely that the dead were never quite gone, held in the shared memory of the fleet, the way the ships had held each other against the threadless. They had spent 1,000,000 years becoming the thing they needed to be to survive, and the thing they had become was a people made entirely of memory and refusal, and the Tyrrek, who were a people of memory and refusal themselves, recognized them at once as kin. In those first months, Ossian came to know the inside of the gray ships, and what he found there changed forever how he thought about courage. He had imagined, before he went aboard, that a fleet 1,000,000 years in the dark would be a grim place, a place of fear and rationing, and the slow despair of people who knew they would never go home. He was wrong about almost all of it. The corridors of Candlewake were warm and lit, hung with banners woven by hands 100 generations gone, and the people who lived there were not grim at all. They were the most stubborn people Ossian had ever met, and stubbornness, he learned, was not the same as despair. It was the opposite of it. The humans had decided, somewhere in the first few centuries of the dark, that since they could not control how long the watch would last, they would control how they kept it, and they had chosen to keep it well. They raised their children, they sang, they named every new ship that came off the fleet's own slow yards after a thing they remembered from a world none of them had ever seen, places out of the oldest records, words that meant a river or a hill or a kind of light at the end of a day, so that the memory of a home 1,000,000 years lost was woven into the very names of the things that defended its absence. The newest ship of the fleet, Ossian learned, only 900 years old, was named Morning. There was no morning in the unmade. There was no sun, no rotation, no day. The humans had named a warship after a thing none of them had ever experienced, because their grandparents' had told them it existed, and they had refused to let the word die, just because the thing it named was gone. Ossian wrote that down and wept over it, and he was not ashamed, because by then, the whole of Cairo Deep had learned that the humans cried easily, and laughed easily, and held nothing back, having long ago decided that a heart kept tight against grief was a heart with slack in it, and slack was the one thing the dark could pull. There was a thing the humans did, in those first months, that Ossian came to love more than any other, and it was the thing that finally made him understand them all the way to the bottom. Once in every cycle, the whole fleet went quiet, and across 240 ships the lights dimmed to a low, warm gold, and the people of the long vigil gathered in their great halls and spoke aloud the names of everything they had ever lost, not only their dead. Everything. The world they came from, which none of them had seen, the seasons they had read about and never felt, the animals out of the old records, the cities, the oceans, the small ordinary things a person on a living world would never think to name. They spoke them all aloud, one after another, for hours, because a thing spoken aloud is a thing remembered, and a thing remembered cannot be unmade, and the humans had decided, somewhere in the long dark, that they would not let the universe forget what it had been, just because they could no longer touch it. Ossian asked Adira Voss once why they did it, when it could only hurt to remember a home they would never reach, and the answer stayed with him for the rest of his life. "We do not do it because it is easy," the human said. "We do it because it is the war. The dark wins when a thing is forgotten. Every name we speak is a small defeat handed to the threadless, a thread it can never pull, a piece of the universe we have refused to surrender. We could have let it all go. It would have been simpler. A fleet that remembers nothing has nothing to lose. But a fleet that remembers nothing is already half unmade, and we decided, a long time ago, that we would rather carry the whole weight of everything we loved than set any of it down to make the journey lighter. That is who we are. We are the ones who would not set it down." Ossian wrote that down too, and he added the cycle of remembering to the practice of Caro Deep, so that from that year forward, the Watchers and the fleet spoke their lost things aloud together, the comets and the worlds, the cold beacons and the oceans, two peoples filling the dark with names, until there was no room left in it for any forgetting at all. And the children born after, the Tirok children, and the human children who grew up side by side in the corridors of a station that was now also a fleet, learned the cycle before they learned anything else, so that the refusal to forget passed down to them as naturally as breathing, and the watch that had been kept for 19 generations became a watch with no foreseeable end, stronger for being shared. He learned the shape of their war too, in detail no record had ever held. The long vigil had not simply fled the threadless for 1,000,000 years. They had fought it, thousands of times, in thousands of ways, and they had kept a complete account of every engagement, because to forget a battle was to forget what they had learned in it, and the dark punished forgetting. Ossian read the account. It was longer than the entire history of the Tirok. He read of the early centuries when the fleet was still learning the rules and lost ships it could not save, ships unmade so completely that only the fleet's deliberate memory of them kept their names from vanishing, and he understood why the humans remembered their dead so fiercely. It was not only love, it was war. Every remembered name was a thread held tight, a small, permanent victory over a thing that wanted nothing left at all. The fleet's roll of the dead was the longest weapon in the galaxy, and they read it aloud, every name, once a year, so that not one of the lost would ever come loose. And there was one more thing Ossian learned, in the first year, and it was the thing that nearly broke the peace, because it meant the war was not quite over. A shard of the threadless had survived. The instruments of Caro Deep found it 11 months after the Great Unmaking, a small wrongness drifting at the very lip of the Marin Gap, a piece of the dark that had been thrown clear in the final moment, and had spent the better part of a year gathering itself back into something that could hunger. It was tiny, next to the thing they had beaten, but it was the same thing, and it had learned the same lessons, and it came toward Caro Deep with the patience of its parent, looking for slack, looking for one mind tired enough, or one memory loose enough, to give it a thread to pull. This time there was no question of running, and no 9 minutes of teaching, and no fear. This time the watch was ready, because the watch was now two peoples instead of one, and they had spent the year learning each other so completely that there was no slack anywhere in the whole of Caro Deep. The instruments caught the shard, and Ossian wrote its coming down in the honest record, and the fleet did not even break its loose and easy formation. Adira Voss simply opened the channel, and the voice that came across it was not tired and not grim, but almost gentle, the way you might speak to the last small ember of a fire you had already mostly put out. "You should not have come back," the voice said, "to the thing in the dark. There is nothing here for you anymore. Everything at this edge of the sky is remembered now, by us and by them, held so tightly that you will find no thread to pull in 1,000 years of trying, but you came anyway, because you do not know how to do anything else. So we will do for you the one kindness left. We will end your hunger, the way we ended the rest of you, not in anger. We are past anger, just so that no one, ever again, has to keep a watch against you." And the two peoples of Caro Deep, the Long Vigil and the Tirok, did together the thing they had done in the great battle, easily now, almost gently, a single shared act of memory, that left the shard nowhere to hold. They remembered the whole of the local sky, every star and every ship and every watcher, so completely and so calmly that there was simply no room in it for a thing that had borrowed its existence from forgetting. The shard reached for slack, and found none, and thinned, and the stars came back behind it, and then it was gone. The last of the threadless, the final ember of the oldest dark, put out at the edge of the Marin Gap by two peoples, holding hands across 1,000,000 years. The instruments of Cairo Deep, honest to the last, recorded that the unmade was empty, and that it had been empty for some time, and that nothing in it remembered ever having been anything else. The war was over. This time it was truly over. And it had ended not with a weapon but with a welcome, not with fire, but with the simple, stubborn refusal of two peoples to let anything at their edge of the sky be lost. Ossian Vale spent the rest of his life writing it all down. He filled the archive of Cairo Deep with the history of the long vigil, 1,000,000 years of it, recovered from the fleet's own records, and from the songs of its people, and from the long patient conversations he held with the office, that carried the name Adira Voss. He learned that the fleet had been sent out by a desperate people, facing a thing that ate their worlds from inside of time. He learned that the original crews had volunteered for a mission they were told would last a few decades, and that when the decades became centuries, and the centuries became something with no name, not one of the ships had turned back. Because turning back meant letting the threadless past, and letting the threadless past meant the death of everything. He learned that whole generations of humans had been born, lived, and died aboard those ships, without ever seeing the worlds they were dying to protect, holding the line for an idea of home that grew more distant and more sacred with every century, until home was not a place anymore but a promise, and the promise was simply this: someone else will be safe because we did not stop. He wrote that down, and over the door of the archive, where every watcher who came after would read it on their first day, he carved the words that the 4,000th Adira Voss had spoken on the night the dark was unmade. Then we are not alone anymore. The galaxy, in time, came to know the story, because the Tirok made sure of it. They had spent 19 generations as the quiet keepers of a record no one read, and now, at last, they had a record worth reading, and they sent it out along the old trade lanes that had gone dead so long ago. The story of the fleet that was lost in time, the fleet that went into the dark to hold back a thing that ate the world, and stayed there for 1,000,000 years, and never failed, and never turned back, and came home at last, to a galaxy that had forgotten it had ever needed saving. The story of the most successful war in the history of anything that ever lived, fought in a dark so complete that its victories left no trace, until the night the last battle was finally seen. And everywhere the story went, the same thing happened. People who had thought themselves alone at the edge of their own dark places, looked up and understood that they might not be. That somewhere out past the last star, something had been standing between them and a horror they never knew existed, asking nothing, recorded by no one, holding a line they would never see. The story did not make people afraid, it made them braver. Because if a fleet of strangers could hold a line for 1,000,000 years in the dark with no reward, and no witness, and no hope of going home, then surely, people thought, surely we can hold ours for one more day. That, in the end, was the gift the long vigil brought back from the dark. Not the death of the threadless, though that mattered. Not the 1,000,000 years of history, though Ossian filled 40 volumes with it. The gift was the proof. The proof that a thing could be done, that a line could be held, that a refusal could outlast a star, that someone, somewhere, would always choose to stand in front of the dark and not move, even if no one would ever know, even if home was gone, even if the war lasted 1,000,000 years. Ossian Vale grew old at Cairo Deep, as the chroniclers before him had, and when at last it was time to pass the stylus to the next watcher, he did the thing his people did, and he chose his successor, and he taught them the post. He told them about comets and drifting hulks, and the slow turning of stars. And then he told them the other thing, the true thing, the thing that the post had always been for even when no one knew it. We are the people who do not look away, he told the young watcher, on her first night at the listening ring. That is the whole of our work. There is a dark out there that wants the universe to forget itself, and the only thing that has ever beaten it is a witness who refuses to stop watching. You think you will spend your life recording comets. You may. But one night, perhaps, something will come out of the dark, and you will be the only one awake to see it, and on that night, the whole weight of everything will rest on whether or not you write it down. So write it down, always. Whatever it is. We are the memory of the galaxy, child, and a thing that is remembered cannot be unmade. The young watcher took the stylus, and she promised, the way Ossian had promised, the way 19 generations had promised before them both. Out beyond the station, the fleet of the Long Vigil drifted in its loose and easy formation, 240 gray ships at rest at last, lit gold by the local star, their guns cold, their watch finally over. They had come 1,000,000 years through the dark to find a home, and they had not found the one they set out from, because that one was gone. They had found a better one. They had found a people who understood, without being told, that the deepest thing one can do for another is to refuse to let them be forgotten. The threadless was gone, and the stars were whole, and the longest war in the history of the galaxy was over. And somewhere in the archive of Caro Deep, in the honest record that does not lie, the first words Ossian Vale ever wrote about the fleet still sat at the top of the first page, in his careful hand, exactly as he had written them on the night they came back. They came back. After everything, they came back. And the first thing they did was stand in front of us. Below those words, over a long lifetime, he had written 1,000,000 years of history, and a war won in the dark, and a horror unmade by memory, and the founding of a people, made of two peoples, who had been doing the same brave thing on opposite sides of the same night. But those first words remained his favorite, because they were the truest, and because everything that came after had grown out of them like a tree from a seed. They came back, and the first thing they did was stand in front of us. It was, Ossian thought, on the last night he ever spent at the listening ring, watching the gray ships rest among the stars they had saved, the only epitaph any of them would ever need. Not for the fleet. The fleet did not die. It lived on, and its people walked the corridors of Caro Deep, and their children learned the Tirok songs and taught the humans theirs, and the archive grew, and the watch went on, better than it ever had, kept now by two peoples instead of one. The epitaph was for the dark. Here, the record said, at the edge of the Marin Gap, on a night 1,000,000 years in coming, the thing that ate the world met a thing it could not eat. It met memory. It met a fleet that would not be forgotten, and a station that would not look away. And between the two of them they did the one thing the dark had never believed possible. They remembered it to death. They held the whole galaxy in place with nothing but their refusal to let it go, and the dark, which had borrowed its whole existence from the forgetting of others, found at last that it had nothing of its own to hold, and so it ended, and the stars came back, and the war was over, and everyone went home. Even the ones who no longer had one. Especially them.